The ship came down through the clouds over Geneva like a mountain falling in reverse. It was black and smooth, shaped like a curved blade, and it was so large that it blocked out the sun for 3 city blocks. People on the streets stopped and stared. Cars pulled over. Children pointed at the sky. The world held its breath. The year was 2187. Humanity had known about alien life for 4 decades. 40 years ago, a Concorde survey ship had found Earth, scanned it, cataloged its people, and granted them juvenile species status in the Galactic Concorde, a coalition of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations. Since then, Earth had received some basic technology, a seat at the lowest table in galactic politics, and very little respect. To the galaxy, humans were children, clever children, perhaps, curious ones. But children all the same. So when the massive diplomatic vessel landed on the lawn outside the United Nations building, every leader on Earth understood that something had gone very wrong somewhere in the stars. The alien who stepped off the ship was called Ambassador Thielvan. He was Rithkari, a species that looked like a giant insect crossed with a suit of armor. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms, a hard shell of dark green chitin, and compound eyes that reflected light like broken glass. His voice, translated through a device on his chest, was calm and smooth. But there was something underneath it, something tight, something desperate. He addressed the United Earth Council in a chamber packed with every president, prime minister, and general that mattered. He did not waste time with greetings. "The Galactic Concorde is at war," he said. "We have been at war for 22 years. We are losing." He told them about the Vraxith Dominion, a hyper-aggressive empire from the far edge of the galaxy, a species of massive 6-limbed predators with bone-like armor growing from their skin. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They did not stop. They simply consumed. World after world had fallen to their swarms, and the Concorde's vast armies, built for order, for peacekeeping, for controlled and calculated warfare, were being torn apart. "Our fleets can match theirs in space," Thielvan continued. "But on the ground, we are failing. The Vraxith fight in close quarters. They flood tunnels, jungles, cities. They overwhelm through sheer aggression. Our infantry was not built for this kind of war." He paused. His compound eyes swept the room. "Your species was." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Thielvan raised one of his 4 hands and a holographic display filled the air above the council table. It showed data charts, biological readouts, stress response analyses, human endurance, human pain tolerance, human adaptability, the ability to function on no sleep, in extreme heat, in freezing cold, while wounded, while starving, while afraid. "By every metric we have measured," Thielvan said, "humans are among the most physically and psychologically resilient species in the known galaxy. You heal quickly, you adapt to nearly any environment, and you continue to function under levels of stress that would shut down the nervous systems of most Concorde species." He folded 2 of his arms behind his back. "The Concorde is formally requesting 10,000 human volunteers to serve as auxiliary infantry on the front lines." The room erupted. Some leaders shouted questions. Others argued with each other. A few sat in stunned silence. But one woman at the far end of the table simply watched and waited. Her name was General Adaora Ose. She was 61 years old, born in Accra, raised in war zones, and had spent her entire adult life in the United Nations Defense Force. She had commanded troops on 4 continents. She had survived 3 assassination attempts. She had a scar that ran from her left ear to her collarbone, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and decided it was not impressive enough to flinch at. When the noise died down, she spoke. "You want 10,000 of our people," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the room went quiet anyway. "To do what exactly? Stand in a line and absorb charges from these Vraxith until they get tired?" Thielvan hesitated. "The role would be auxiliary support, frontline defense, holding positions while—" "Cannon fodder," General Ose said flatly. "You want cannon fodder? The silence that followed was so heavy it could have cracked the floor. Thielvan's mandibles clicked once, twice, but he said nothing. General Ose leaned forward. "We will give you your 10,000. But we choose who goes. We train them our way. We equip them with whatever you can provide, and we deploy them under our own command structure. You give us the mission, and we execute it however we see fit." Thielvan looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the other leaders in the room, hoping someone might offer a softer deal. No one did. Every eye in the room had turned to Ose, and every head was nodding. "Agreed," Thielvan said. The details were worked out over the following weeks. Technology transfers, transport arrangements, communication protocols. The Concorde thought they were getting warm bodies with strong bones. They thought they were hiring primitive muscle. They did not ask what kind of soldiers Earth would send. They did not think it mattered. That was their first mistake. On the day the selection process began, General Ose stood in a classified briefing room deep beneath the UNDEF headquarters in New York. The room had no windows. The walls were lined with screens, and every screen showed a face. Hundreds of faces, men and women, from every corner of the earth. These were not regular soldiers. These were the ones that regular soldiers told stories about. Tier 1 Special Forces operators, from a dozen nations. Guerrilla fighters who had survived conflicts that never made the news. Snipers who had made kills at distances that shouldn't have been possible. Close-quarters combat specialists who had cleared rooms full of armed enemies with nothing but a knife and bad intentions. Arctic warfare survivors. Desert warfare ghosts. Jungle fighters who could disappear into a handful of leaves and reappear behind you with a blade at your throat. General Ose looked at the faces on the screens. She thought about Thielvan and his polite request for infantry. She thought about the Concorde's neat little wars, fought with algorithms and formation lines, and acceptable loss percentages. She almost felt sorry for the Vraxith. Almost. She pressed a button on the console and opened a channel to every operator on those screens. "You have all been briefed on the situation," she said. "An alien empire out there thinks it knows what violence looks like. A galactic coalition thinks we are children playing with sharp sticks. In 3 months, we are going to travel across the stars and show both of them how wrong they are." She paused. "They asked for soldiers. We are going to send them something else entirely, something this galaxy has never seen and will never forget. Report to your staging areas within 72 hours. Pack light. We are going to war." She cut the channel and stood alone in the dark room, surrounded by silence and the soft glow of screens. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. The transport ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel above a world called Palith 9, and the humans got their first look at a galactic military hub. It was a gray planet, dry and flat, covered from pole to pole in military installations, barracks the size of cities, landing pads that stretched to the horizon, weapons factories that never stopped burning. Millions of soldiers from hundreds of species moved across its surface like ants on a hill, all of them preparing for a war they were slowly losing. The Terran Auxiliary Corps, 10,000 strong, designated TAC, landed on the eastern continent in a row of heavy transports. They stepped out onto alien soil under an alien sky with 2 pale suns, and not one of them looked impressed. They had been briefed. They had been trained. And most of them had already survived things worse than a new planet. The Concorde had assigned them a section of the base near the outer perimeter. It was far from the command center, far from the good facilities, and right next to the waste processing plant. The message was clear. The humans were auxiliaries, extras, filler. They were expected to stay quiet, follow orders, and die in the right places when the time came. The TAC settled into their assigned area and immediately began making it their own. Within the first 6 hours, they had reorganized the barracks, set up a field gym using scrap metal and cargo containers, established a combat training ground, and posted a rotating guard on every entry point. By the 12th hour, they were running live fire drills with the Concorde-issued energy weapons, testing range, recoil, and stopping power. By the 18th hour, they had already modified several of the weapons to hit harder at the cost of battery life, something the Concorde engineers said was impossible. The other species on Palith, 9, noticed the humans quickly. It was hard not to. The TAC ran training exercises at 3 in the morning, screaming cadences in half a dozen Earth languages. They practiced hand-to-hand combat in open yards where anyone walking by could see. They sparred with a brutality that made other soldiers stop and stare. 2 Cathari logistics officers watched a TAC grappling session, and one of them fainted. But the thing that unsettled the Concord forces more than anything else was the quiet work. In the evenings, when other species rested or ran equipment checks, the humans studied. They pulled up every piece of data they could find on the Vraxith biology, behavior, battle tactics, autopsy reports. They projected holographic models of Vraxith anatomy and spent hours marking weak points, joints, eye clusters, the soft tissue beneath the jaw plates, the gap between the second and third rib, where the carapace was thinnest. They were not studying an enemy. They were studying prey. Commander Celis of the Cathari was assigned as the Concord's liaison officer to the TAC. He was a slender, bird-like creature with silver feathers and wide, golden eyes. He had served in the Concord military for 30 years. He had seen dozens of species come and go through Paleth 9. He thought he knew what soldiers looked like. He did not know what to make of the humans. On his second day with the TAC, he watched a close-quarters combat demonstration led by a woman named Sergeant Major Priya Kapoor. She was not tall. She was not heavily built, but she moved through 6 sparring opponents in under 90 seconds, using a combination of strikes, joint locks, and throws that left all 6 of them on the ground. One of them had to be carried to the medical station. The whole time, her expression never changed. She looked bored. Celis left the demonstration early. His feathers would not stop trembling. That night, he filed his first official report to Concord High Command. He stared at the screen for a long time before writing a single line. "These are not soldiers. I do not know what they are." 2 weeks after the TAC arrived, the Concord organized a joint training exercise, a war game simulation designed to evaluate the humans in a controlled environment. The scenario was simple. The TAC would defend a fixed position against a simulated Vraxith swarm. They would be outnumbered 50 to 1. They would have limited ammunition and no air support. According to every projection model the Concord had, the position was indefensible. Standard doctrine said to hold for 6 minutes, inflict as many casualties as possible, and then execute an orderly retreat. The wargame began at dawn. The simulated Vraxith poured across the field in a wave of claws and teeth and screaming fury. The TAC held their positions and opened fire. Energy bolts and kinetic rounds tore into the first wave. The simulated swarm kept coming. 6 minutes passed. The Concord observers waited for the retreat signal. It never came. Instead, the TAC counterattacked. Fire teams burst from their defensive positions and pushed forward into the swarm. They moved in coordinated groups of 4, covering each other, rotating through kill zones they had set up during the night without telling anyone. They had buried improvised explosives across the field, using materials scavenged from the base. They had mapped every ditch, every ridge, every choke point. They had turned the entire simulation area into a killing ground. The simulated Vraxith fell in waves. Every time one group of humans ran low on power cells, another team covered them. When the simulation tried to flank them, the TAC had already anticipated it and placed teams in ambush positions. When the swarm concentrated for a final push, the humans detonated a chain of buried charges that tore through the center mass of the assault. 22 minutes after the exercise began, every single simulated Vraxith was dead. The scoring system crashed. It had not been designed for this outcome. The scenario had no win condition, because no one had imagined that winning was possible. The Concord observers sat in absolute silence. Several of them had stopped taking notes. A Moravi general, a being made of living crystal who had commanded armies for over 1,000 years, stood at the observation window and did not move for a very long time. Commander Celis stood next to him, his golden eyes wide, his feathers pressed flat against his body. "How?" the Moravi general asked. His voice sounded like glass cracking. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable. Celis shook his head slowly. "They did not know that, and I do not think it would have mattered if they did." That evening, Ambassador Thiel Von sat in a private chamber with the Concord's senior military leadership. The holographic replay of the war game floated above the table. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, the Moravi general broke the silence. What kind of world produces beings like this? Thiel Von reached for his console and pulled up Earth's file. He had read it before, of course. Every Concord diplomat studied the profiles of junior species, but he had never truly understood what the data meant until now. He scrolled through the history, and it unfolded like a nightmare. War after war after war. Empires rising and falling. Genocides. Famines. Plagues that killed hundreds of millions. Ice ages that nearly ended their species. And through all of it, the humans had survived. Not by hiding, not by fleeing, by fighting, by adapting, by becoming harder and sharper and more dangerous with every generation. Thiel Von turned the display so the entire table could see the long, blood-soaked record of human history. The cruelest world in the galaxy, he said quietly. We brought soldiers from the cruelest world in the galaxy. The Moravi general stared at the data. Then he looked at the frozen image of the war game's final moment. 19 humans, standing in a field of simulated carnage, not one of them breathing hard. No, the general said slowly. You did not bring soldiers. I have commanded soldiers for 1,000 years. I know what soldiers are. He paused. His crystalline body flickered with pale, troubled light. I do not have a word for what those creatures are. But I think, before this war is over, the Vraxith will invent one. The planet was called Vreth Korun, and it was a green hell. Thick jungle covered every inch of land. The air was hot, wet, and heavy with the smell of rotting plants. The trees grew so tall and so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. Rivers of dark water cut through the undergrowth like veins. Strange creatures screamed in the canopy above. And somewhere beneath it all, in tunnels and hollows and nests, dug deep into the earth, the Vraxith waited. 3 Concord armies had tried to take Vreth Korun back. 3 armies had failed. The first had been ambushed in the lowlands and torn apart in under 2 days. The second had established a forward base that the Vraxith overran in a single night. The third had lasted a week before the commanding officer ordered a full retreat, having lost 40% of his troops to an enemy he could barely see. Now the fourth attempt was underway. A combined Concord force of 80,000 Rithkari heavy infantry, Cathari aerial scouts, Moravi siege engineers dropped from orbit and established a massive fortified beachhead on the planet's northern coast. Alongside them, deployed for their first real combat operation, were 5,000 members of the Terran Auxiliary Corps. Commander Celis watched the humans disembark from their landing craft and felt his feathers tighten against his body. They looked different now. On Palith 9, they had been unsettling. Here, stepping onto the soil of a combat zone, they were something else entirely. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning the tree line, reading the terrain. They spread out without being told, finding cover, checking sight lines, communicating in hand signals that Celis could not read. They were quiet, focused, ready. The Concord's battle plan was textbook. Orbital bombardment would clear the landing zone. Then, the infantry would advance, in a wide formation through the jungle, pushing the Vraxith back toward the southern mountains, where heavy weapons could finish them off. It was clean, logical, and mathematically sound. Every model predicted success. The models were wrong. The bombardment went as planned. The advance did not. The Concord infantry moved into the jungle in their neat formations. Energy shields raised, weapon lines dressed, and the Vraxith hit them from everywhere at once. They came from below, bursting out of tunnels that the orbital scans had missed. They came from above, dropping from the canopy like nightmares with claws. They came from the flanks, flooding through the undergrowth in waves of chitin and fury. The Concord lines broke within hours. The Rithkari, despite their heavy armor, could not fight in the dense jungle. Their formations were useless between the trees. The Cathari scouts were dragged from the air by Vraxith acid spitters. The Moravi engineers, brilliant in open terrain, were blind and helpless in the green darkness. Panic spread through the ranks like poison. Units lost contact with each other. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. The retreat signal went out before midday. The TAC did not retreat. Colonel James Harrow, commanding the human contingent on Vreth Korun, received the retreat order and acknowledged it. Then he switched to the TAC's private channel and said 4 words. "We go forward." The humans broke into small unit fire teams, groups of 4 to 8 operators, each one trained to function independently. They shed their heavy gear. They painted their faces with mud and crushed leaves. They checked their blades, their explosives, their thermal optics, and then they disappeared into the jungle like they had been born in it. Because in a way, they had. Humans had been fighting in jungles for as long as jungles had existed. The dense terrain, the poor visibility, the heat, the insects, the constant threat from every direction, these were not obstacles to the TAC. They were home. Fire Team Rava, led by Sergeant Kofi Asante, was the first to make contact. Asante was a tall, broad-shouldered man from Ghana who had spent 15 years in special operations before the Concorde had ever heard of Earth. He moved through the jungle in absolute silence. His team spread out behind him in a staggered file. They found a Vraxith patrol of 12, huge, armored creatures moving through the undergrowth with the confidence of apex predators on their own ground. Asante held up a fist. His team stopped. He studied the patrol through his thermal scope and identified the largest one, the Alpha, the leader. He signaled his team. They understood, without words. The ambush lasted 9 seconds. 2 shaped charges detonated at the front and rear of the patrol, funneling the surviving Vraxith into a kill zone. 3 operators opened fire with modified energy rifles, targeting the weak joints beneath the arm plates. Asante himself closed the distance on the Alpha, ducked under a claw swipe that would have cut him in half, and drove a reinforced combat blade into the soft gap beneath its jaw. The creature dropped. The rest of the patrol died in the crossfire before they understood what was happening. Asante pulled his blade free and wiped it on his leg. His team had already begun moving again. Across the jungle, similar scenes played out. Fire teams set ambushes along Vraxith patrol routes. They rigged tripwires with explosive charges in the tunnel entrances. They found Vraxith nesting sites and destroyed them with thermite. They did not fight the way the Concorde fought in lines, with shields, according to plans drawn up by computers. They fought the way humans had always fought when the stakes were high and the rules were gone. They improvised. They adapted. They became part of the jungle itself. But the true shock came at night. The Vraxith were nocturnal hunters. Their eyes could see in near total darkness. Their other senses, vibration, heat, chemical traces, made them lethal after sundown. Every Concorde army that had fought the Vraxith had pulled back at night, retreating behind fortified walls and hoping to survive until morning. Fighting the Vraxith at night was considered suicide. Everyone knew this. The TAC had not read that rule. As the sun set and the jungle plunged into blackness, the humans activated their thermal optics and moved out. They hunted in the dark. They used the Vraxith's own tunnel networks, crawling through spaces that no Concorde soldier would have entered. They set up overlapping fields of fire and waited with the patience of creatures who had spent 100,000 years hunting in the dark on a world full of things that wanted to eat them. The Vraxith did not expect to be hunted. They had never been hunted. They were the hunters. They were the apex predators. That was the foundation of their entire identity, their culture, their psychology. That foundation cracked on the first night. By dawn, the jungle floor was littered with Vraxith dead. The Alpha, that had coordinated the swarm in the southern sector, was found with its throat cut in its own nest. 3 tunnel networks had been collapsed with buried charges. 17 patrol groups had been eliminated without sending a single distress signal. The surviving Concorde soldiers, still huddled behind their fortifications, emerged into the morning light and found the TAC operators sitting calmly at the edge of the perimeter. Some were cleaning their weapons. Some were eating ration packs. A few were sleeping, leaning against trees with their rifles across their laps, as relaxed as if they were back home on a Sunday morning. Sergeant Asante was drinking water from a canteen. There was dark Vraxith blood on his armor, his hands, and his face. He looked up at a Rithkari officer who was staring at him with all four of his compound eyes wide open. "Rough night?" the officer asked, in a voice that shook slightly. Asante shrugged. "Quiet, actually. Thought there would be more of them." Within 72 hours, the Vraxith swarm on Vreth Karun was broken. The surviving creatures retreated underground and stopped attacking. The planet was declared secured not by the 80,000-strong Concord force, but by 5,000 humans who had done most of the fighting in the dark, alone, on foot, with nothing but small arms, blades, and a kind of calm violence that the galaxy had never witnessed. Commander Celis sat in his quarters that night and wrote his second report to Concord High Command. His hands trembled so badly that it took him 3 attempts to type it. When he finished, the report was only 2 lines long. "They do not fight like soldiers. They fight like something that was hunted for its entire evolutionary history and learned to hunt back. I am afraid of them. I think the Vraxith should be too." Word traveled fast in the galaxy, faster than light, faster than ships, faster than war itself. Within weeks of Vreth Karun, every species in the galactic Concord had heard the story. The details changed, depending on who told it. The numbers got bigger, the darkness got darker, the humans got stranger, but the core of it stayed the same. A junior species, barely 40 years out of its own atmosphere, had done what 3 full Concord armies could not. And they had done it at night, in the jungle, with knives. The Concord High Command redeployed the Terran Auxiliary Corps to 4 more fronts. They were no longer auxiliary in anything but name. They were the tip of the spear, and everyone knew it. On the frozen world of Kale Dis, the Vraxith had dug a massive hive complex into the base of a mountain range. The temperatures on the surface dropped to 70 degrees below zero. The Concord had written the planet off. They said no ground assault could survive those conditions long enough to reach the hive. The Tax Mountain Warfare Unit, 2,000 operators who had trained in the Himalayas, the Andes, and the Arctic, disagreed. They marched across 40 kilometers of open ice in a blizzard, reached the mountain range in 2 days, and spent the 3rd day planting charges along a fault line in the ice shelf above the hive. When they blew the charges, 100 million tons of ice collapsed onto the Vraxith complex. The ground shook so hard, it registered on seismic monitors 3 continents away. Not a single human was lost. On the orbital station Lethis, 4, a Vraxith boarding party had seized 17 decks and taken 200 Concord personnel hostage. The station's commander had already begun negotiating a surrender when the TAC boarding team arrived. 36 operators breached the station through maintenance shafts, ventilation systems, and 1 exterior airlock that they opened while wearing nothing but standard combat suits and emergency oxygen. They cleared all 17 decks in 9 hours. Every Vraxith on the station was killed. Every hostage was recovered alive. The station's commander later said that he never saw the humans enter and only knew the operation was over when one of them walked onto the bridge, covered in alien blood, and asked if there was any coffee. But it was the battle on the desert world of Omral that created a legend. Omral was a scorched, rocky planet with no water and no cover. The Vraxith had established a forward staging base in a valley surrounded by jagged stone ridges. A Concord strike force was sent to destroy it, but the Vraxith spotted them early and launched a counterattack through the only pass into the valley, a narrow gap between 2 cliff walls. A single TAC sniper was positioned at the top of that pass. Her name was Corporal Yuki Tanaka. She was 29 years old, small and quiet, from a town in northern Japan. She had been shooting since she was 14. She had been killing since she was 21. She was very, very good at her job. The Vraxith came through the pass in a flood of claws and armor. Tanaka began firing. She did not panic. She did not rush. She picked her targets with the calm precision of someone sorting papers at a desk. 1 shot, 1 kill. The weak point below the jaw. The gap in the shoulder plate. The exposed joint behind the knee. She fired and fired and fired, while the wind howled around her, and the stone cracked from the heat, and the Vraxith screamed below. She held that pass for 3 days. 72 hours. She slept in 20-minute intervals. She ate nothing but protein paste and drank recycled water from her suit's emergency supply. When her primary rifle overheated, She switched to her secondary. When her secondary ran dry, she used a Concord-issue energy weapon she had taken from a dead supply crate. When that failed, she threw grenades. When the grenades ran out, she rigged rocks with explosive charges and rolled them down the cliff. When the extraction team finally reached her, she had over 400 confirmed kills. The pass was choked with Vraxith dead. The extraction pilot, a Kethari with 20 years of combat flight experience, landed his ship, walked to where Tanaka was sitting against a rock, and could not speak. He just stood there, staring at the field of bodies below. Tanaka looked up at him, squinted against the sun, and said, "Sorry about the mess." The galaxy did not know what to do with stories like these. They were not supposed to happen. War, in the Concord's understanding, was a structured activity with rules and predictions and acceptable outcomes. What the humans were doing was something else. Something older and rawer and far more frightening. The political effects hit almost as hard as the military ones. In the halls of the Concord's government, delegates from 1,000 species began asking questions that had nothing to do with the Vraxith. If humanity could do this with 10,000 volunteers using borrowed equipment, what could they do with their own fleet? Their own weapons factories? Their own shipyards? What would happen when this juvenile species decided it wanted something more than a low seat at a galactic table? Some factions pushed to restrict human military development immediately. They wanted limits on Earth's access to advanced technology. They wanted the TAC disbanded after the war. They wanted humans kept small and manageable. Other factions argued the opposite, that Earth should be elevated to full Concord membership immediately, given a permanent seat on the High Council, and treated as an equal power. Not out of generosity, but out of fear. Better to have the humans as partners, they said, than to risk making them enemies. The debates raged. But while the politicians argued, something happened that silenced everyone. The Vraxith Dominion sent a message. In 22 years of war, the Vraxith had never communicated with the Concord. Not once. No demands, no threats, no offers of peace. They simply attacked, consumed, and moved on. Communication was beneath them. They were the apex species, the ultimate predators, and prey did not deserve words. But the message they sent now was not addressed to the Concord. It was sent directly to Earth, on a frequency the Vraxith had never used before, using translation protocols they had clearly built for this single purpose. It was short. Just 3 words, repeated once. "What are you?" The message arrived at UNDF headquarters in New York at 4 in the morning. General Osei was woken from sleep and handed the translation. She read it once. She read it twice. Then she sat down at a communication terminal and composed a reply. She did not consult with politicians. She did not ask for approval. She did not run it through committees or diplomats or public relations teams. She typed it herself, authorized its transmission on every open channel in the galaxy, and went back to bed. The reply read, "We are what happens when a species spends 300,000 years as both predator and prey on a world that never stopped trying to kill it. We are not your enemies. We are not your rivals. We are Earth's answer, and we are just getting started." Every species in the Concord received that message. Every military leader, every politician, every citizen with access to a communication terminal read it or heard it within hours. On 100,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size felt something shift beneath their feet. The galaxy had changed, and there was no going back. Deep in Vraxith space, on a world that no Concord ship had ever reached, the ruling caste of the Vraxith Dominion gathered for the first time in centuries. They were ancient creatures, enormous and slow, their carapaces scarred and darkened by ages of conquest. They had ruled unchallenged for longer than most Concord species had existed. They had never retreated. They had never doubted. They had never questioned their place at the top of the food chain. Now they sat in their vast, dark chamber and watched holographic replays of human combat footage. They watched Asante moving through a jungle at night, killing without sound. They watched Tanaka holding a pass against hundreds, alone, for 3 days. They watched humans charge into impossible odds and come out the other side covered in blood and still fighting. Something stirred in the collective consciousness of the Vraxith ruling caste. It was old. Older than memory. It came from a time before they were the apex, before they were the hunters, when they had been small and soft and afraid of the dark. They had buried that feeling so deep and so long ago that they had forgotten its name. They did not yet have a word for what they were feeling, but they would learn one. The humans had a word for it. The humans had always had a word for it. The word was fear. No Concord fleet had ever entered the Vrax system. No Concord scout had ever mapped it. No Concord strategist had ever seriously planned an attack on it. Vrax Prime was the beating heart of the Dominion, a world of billions, defended by the largest concentration of Vraxith forces in existence. It was not a target. It was a death sentence. Everyone in the galaxy knew this. General Adaora Ose stood before the Concord High Command and told them she wanted to attack it anyway. The chamber fell silent. 40 admirals and generals from 30 species stared at her. The Moravi general, whose crystalline body had grown dimmer over the months of war, leaned forward. "You are suggesting a direct assault on the Vraxith homeworld?" he said slowly. "With how many troops?" 5,000, Ose said. The silence became something heavier. Something that pressed against the walls. 5,000, the Moravi repeated. Against a world of billions. We are not going to fight a world of billions. We are going to kill the ones that matter. Ose pulled up a holographic display. It showed the structure of Vraxith society, the ruling caste at the center, the warrior caste around them, the drones and workers spreading outward like rings in a tree. The Vraxith are a hive species. Their ruling caste controls everything. Strategy, coordination, expansion, it all flows from the top. We cut the head off, and the body dies. She pointed to a structure deep in the heart of Vrax Prime's largest continent. A hive palace, ancient and enormous, rising from the surface like a mountain of bone. The ruling caste is here. 5,000 TAC operators drop directly onto the planet, punch through to this structure, and eliminate the leadership. Your fleet holds orbit and keeps their ships off our backs. We handle the ground. Ambassador Thiel Von, who had started all of this with a polite request for infantry, shifted uncomfortably. "General, the losses would be high," Ose said. "We know. This is a suicide mission," a Kethari admiral said flatly. Ose looked at him with those steady, scarred, unblinking eyes. "Where I come from, we have another name for it. We call it Tuesday." The Concord approved the plan. They had no better option. The war had turned in their favor since the humans arrived. But the Vraxith were endless. For every world the Concord retook, the Dominion pushed forward on another front. The only way to end it was to end the Dominion itself. And the only force in the galaxy willing to try was 5,000 humans who had already done the impossible so many times that they had stopped counting. The TAC assembled on a staging station at the edge of Vraxith space. 5,000 operators. The best of the best of the best. Sergeant Kofi Asante was there, his jaw set, his blade sharpened, his team around him. Corporal Yuki Tanaka was there, quiet as always, her rifle across her knees. Sergeant Major Priya Kapoor was there, leading the close-quarters assault element. Colonel Harrow commanded the overall operation. And behind all of them, watching from a command ship in orbit, General Ose waited. The Concord fleet jumped into the Vrax system at dawn. Or what passed for dawn. Vrax Prime orbited a dim red star, and the light that reached its surface was the color of old blood. The fleet immediately came under fire. Vraxith warships swarmed from every angle, and the space around the planet turned into a storm of energy blasts and burning metal. Through that storm, the drop pods fell. They came down like rain. Thousands of small armored capsules screaming through the atmosphere of Vrax Prime. The Vraxith anti-orbital batteries opened up, and the sky turned white with fire. Pods exploded. Others spun off course and crashed into mountains, oceans, wastelands. Colonel Harrow watched the casualty counter climb on his display and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had known this would happen. Out of 5,000 operators, roughly 3,200 made it to the surface alive. They landed in hell. Vrax Prime was a world built by and 4 predators. The ground was hard and dark, covered in structures made of chitin and secreted resin towers, walls, tunnels, all of it grown rather than built. The air was thick with chemical signals that made human eyes water and skin itch. And everywhere, in every direction, the Vraxith came. They came in numbers that made the battles on Vreth Korun look like skirmishes. Warrior caste Vraxith, larger and faster than the ones the Tak had fought before. Specialized breeds with acid glands, with bony projectile launchers fused into their arms, with massive shield-like growths on their heads. They poured out of every structure, every tunnel, every crack in the earth. The ground itself seemed to be alive with them. The Tak fought. They fought the way they had always fought, in small teams, in the gaps, in the dark, and the dirt, and the chaos. But this was different. This was not a jungle or a mountain pass or an orbital station. This was the enemy's home, the center of their power, and there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to retreat. The first 12 hours were the worst. The Tak advanced toward the hive palace meter by meter, paying for every step with blood. Squad leaders fell, and the next person in line took over without hesitation. Weapons broke, overheated, ran dry. Operators switched to sidearms, then to blades, then to whatever they could pick up from the ground. A corporal named Diaz used the severed claw of a dead Vraxith as a weapon for 2 hours when everything else failed. A sergeant named Okonkwo held a corridor alone for 40 minutes with a jammed rifle and a combat knife, standing on a pile of dead Vraxith, screaming in a language that was not any language at all, but something older and deeper, something that came from the base of the human spine. Commander Celis watched from orbit. The Concorde fleet had deployed every sensor, every camera, every drone they had to track the ground assault. The footage played on every screen on every ship in the fleet. Thousands of alien officers stood in silence and watched the humans die and fight and die and fight and keep going. Celis stood at his console with tears running down his feathered face. He had spent months with these creatures. He had eaten with them. He had laughed at their strange jokes. He had watched them train and plan and sharpen their blades. And now he watched them tear themselves apart against an entire world. And he understood, finally and completely, what they were. The second day was worse. The Tak had been reduced to fewer than 2,000. They were exhausted, wounded, running on stimulants and fury and something that could not be measured or quantified, something that the Concorde's computers and projections and algorithms had never accounted for. The human will to keep going. Not courage, exactly. Not bravery. Something more stubborn than that. Something that looked at death and impossible odds and total destruction and simply refused. By the 72nd hour, Sergeant Asante and what remained of his company, 19 people out of an original 200, reached the outer wall of the hive palace. Asante had taken a claw strike across his ribs. One of his arms hung at a wrong angle. His armor was cracked and burned, and covered in so many layers of Vraxith blood that it had turned black. He could barely see out of his left eye. He could barely stand. He stood anyway. His team breached the wall with their last-shaped charge. The explosion tore a hole through chitin that was 3 meters thick, and they poured through it into the chamber beyond. The ruling caste was waiting for them. They were ancient creatures. Each one was the size of a shuttle, their carapaces dark and scarred with centuries of growth. They sat in a circle in a chamber that was older than most civilizations, surrounded by the bones and trophies of 10,000 conquered worlds. They had ruled the Dominion for longer than humanity had existed. They had consumed empires. They had ended species. They had never, in all their long and terrible history, been challenged in their own throne room. They looked at the doorway and saw 19 humans. 19 bleeding, broken, battered humans standing in the shattered entrance to their palace. 19 creatures from a small blue world on the edge of the galaxy, covered in dirt and ash and blood their own, and the blood of thousands of Vraxith dead. 19 beings who had punched through an entire planet to reach this room, and who stood now in the doorway with cracked armor, and dull blades, and empty rifles, and eyes that burned with something the ruling caste had never encountered in all their millennia of existence. The eldest of the ruling caste shifted its massive body. It had been searching for a word since the first reports of humans had reached Vrax Prime. It had studied their footage. It had listened to the recordings of their screams and their cadences and their terrible, relentless silence. And now, looking at the 19 wrecked and defiant figures in its doorway, it found the word at last. The word was dread. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. History does not record the details. Some things are too violent for the record. What is known is that when the Concorde's recovery team finally reached the Hive Palace 6 hours later, they found the ruling caste dead and Sergeant Kofi Asante sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his blade across his knees, and 11 of his 19 soldiers still alive around him. He looked up at the Concorde officers. His face was unreadable. "It is done," he said. The Vraxith Dominion surrendered 3 days later. It was the first and only surrender in their species' history. Without the ruling caste, the warrior caste lost coordination, then cohesion, then the will to fight. The war that had lasted 22 years ended not with a fleet battle or a treaty negotiation, but with 19 humans in a room. The galaxy changed after that. Earth was given full membership in the Galactic Concorde, a permanent seat on the High Council, a formal apology, delivered by Ambassador Thiel Von himself, for every time humanity had been called juvenile, primitive, or lesser. Technology flowed freely. Trade routes opened. Humanity stepped onto the galactic stage not as a child species, but as something the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization forged in violence that chose, now that the violence was over, to build instead of burn. Years later, on worlds across the galaxy, alien children asked their parents about the war. The stories were always the same. "We asked the humans for soldiers," the parents would say. "We thought we knew what that word meant. We were wrong." In every language in the galaxy, the word soldier means one who serves, one who follows, one who endures. But on Earth, that word carries the weight of 300,000 years of blood and fire and survival. On Earth, it means something older, something with teeth. Commander Celis, long retired from the Concorde military, visited Earth for the first time on the 5th anniversary of the war's end. He traveled to a place called Normandy, in a country called France, and walked along rows of white stone markers in a green field by the sea. Each marker bore a name. There were thousands of them. They belonged to humans who had died in a war fought 2 centuries before humanity had ever reached the stars. He stood there for a long time, reading names he could not pronounce, feeling the wind off the ocean, watching the sunlight move across the grass. He understood now. The humans had not learned violence among the stars. They had brought it with them, carried it in their bones and their blood and their memory, forged by a world that had spent 300 millennia trying to kill them and failing every single time. He pulled out his communication device and filed one final report. He had carried the words in his head for years, waiting for the moment they would feel complete. He typed slowly, carefully, and with a steady hand for the first time since he had met the humans. The report was 1 line long. They were never soldiers. They were always slayers. We simply had not earned the distinction yet. He put the device away and stood among the graves of Earth's ancient dead, and the wind blew, and the grass bent, and somewhere far above, beyond the blue sky and the thin shell of atmosphere, the stars waited. The stars had always waited, but now they waited for humanity, and humanity, as it always had, was ready.